timeline, and there are many other characters which one could bring forth, but I would rather, the book has been written to be read rather than PowerPointed, and there are just really too many things. And this also will not be the last presentation that I do on this work, so I was thinking what I would do is present it as a series of sort of focal points on different aspects, so that as a body of presentations it tries to cover the sort of meat and potatoes of the thing. What I wanted to do is kind of address that stuff to do with white supremacy head on, and I have done that throughout the book. It's a book which does not shy away from difficult subjects, if I'm completely honest. It's a deep reading of the origins of totalitarianism from Arendt, which attempts to bring that directly into the Capitol riots in the United States in January this year, because it literally took place while I was writing, and there are other kind of biological models which relate to the pandemic and extremism. What I'm going to do is read from the concluding chapter, because I feel as though I've tried to sum up some of the aspects in the book, which some of the questions and some of my own sort of sympathies with the mythology which underpins this architecture, because it's very difficult just to go in and be like, oh, it's all bad, let's tear it all down, because actually, this is sort of a superstructure of how we've understood the world, really, for at least 12,000 years, and you cannot just throw all that away. So it's a sort of controversial area, I think, and I think it's an important one precisely because people really end up going down these kind of conspiracy theory rabbit holes when they don't understand the context and, I guess, the power dynamics of who is telling what story and to whom. A lot of this book was inspired by people around me who were very dear to me that fell down precisely these types of conspiratorial white extremist conspiracy theory, and so that was also a sort of underlying question which I guess I had, and maybe a skepticism which I had. All right, so chapter 8 is One More Time with Feeling. It's the last chapter. It's quite long. It also deals with the palm plantations, which are still in huge use. It proposes to some extent that maybe the sacred date palm tree is actually an expression of the economic minority, showing that basically they have the enslaved persons and the palm plantations to have the power. It's possible that that's actually all this is. It's just about power, and not about, transcendental meditation. Which, yeah, all right. I live and write in a time of radical change. Mutations are not only likely, they are on a biological, social, and personal level inevitable. One of the difficulties with drawing political conclusions from epigenetic and mutational models of organic development is setting them up as a binary in the first place. Genetic mutation can be likened straightforwardly to novel cultural mutations. Epigenetics can be tied to rhythms and cyclical patterns. In order to observe these phenomena from the fixity of a single life, I can bring forth linear and cyclical conceptions of time. As the god Shamash is held to express in the image here, from 900 BCE Sippar, which is modern-day Iraq. These may also be drawn upon and shared with others. So to clarify, what he's holding here is the linear time and the cyclical time. It's representational. But that's actually really the crux of this, is like, if you think of mutation as kind of a chronological process, then epigenetics is a rhythmic process. It comes back, it always returns. The porosity and boundaries of language, memory, and thought are such that ideas can also be shared across multiple lifetimes, across generations. And while the prevalence and use of an idea must always be understood in the context of when, in history, it has been applied, establishing that context can also be tricky. Knowledge of how racist bigotry was developed in order to justify a market for enslaved black humans gives me the necessary context to understand the history of racism, as demonstrated by Professor Ibrahim Choli Kendi, which is an area which I pick up in detail in chapter 3. What I'm going to try and do now is come back to some of the questions there which I raise in chapter 3, which focuses primarily on totalitarianism and the history that it has going all the way back into the earliest forms of slavery, and how that relates to esoteric ideas back then as well. Okay, enough jumping around. Esoteric law holds that my ability to bring forth different concepts of time, or indeed of anything at all, has an alternative history than that of evolutionary psychology. This isn't something that I particularly wanted to include in this work, broad in scope as it already is, but the awkwardness of these ideas also makes me want to address them head on, once and for all. What I discovered in the process of concluding this book is that the esoteric narrative of the lost land of Atlantis underpins the vast bulk of the secret teachings of the mystery schools. The same cults that employ the Corinthian order and the secret lexicon of cultural forms which that order expresses. Quote, "If we can grasp the Greek temple through spiritual sight, we will recognize that in this marvelous work of art, human beings have transformed the sense-perceptible, material element in such a way that every part has become an expression of the spiritual." That's Rudolf Steiner, Atlantis, Fate of the Lost Land and Its Secret Knowledge, 2001. Because the story of Atlantis is so central to the chronology and beliefs maintained in the institutions of old white men, I believe it should be addressed in a work concerned with cultural hegemony, racism, and the architecture of power. I looked for some years to find the actual book, Atlantis, published by Rudolf Steiner Press in 2001. Along the journey, I found the ultra-racialized versions of Aleister Crowley and Edward Bulwer Lytton, but dismissed them out of hand as hysterical reactions to the racial anxieties of their age, the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But if you think there is a racially unambiguous version to the secret history, you will be disappointed. Rudolf Steiner was born in Murakami, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in modern-day Austria, in 1861. He is said to have developed the first organic farming practices in the early 20th century. Steiner also pioneered several schools of thought concerning holistic education with applications for the arts, architecture, esoteric Christianity, and philosophy. He is perhaps most famous as a mystic and clairvoyant, someone who could access the alternative realms of reality that are purportedly only available to those who are initiated. Based on these experiences, he developed his own school of esoteric wisdom, known as anthroposophy, as cited in chapter 1. This air of the mysterious serves, however, to exoticize Steiner, which can have the effect of absolving the racial prejudice his version of the Atlantis myth clearly replicates. Although he rejected the idea of racial predetermination, which many white colonialists sought to extract from Darwin at that time, reading Steiner's Atlantis today can be problematic. At best, Steiner's Atlantis often reads like an apology for the racial angst conjured up by references to cascading series of sub-races, divine messages, and natural healers. At times, his language confirms his belief in racial hierarchy. For example, passages where he appears to be trying to explain away racial biases, such as, quote, "Among the seventh subrace, the Mongols, the faculty of thought also developed, but characteristics of their earlier subrace, especially the fourth, remain present in them to a much higher degree than the fifth and the sixth." Unquote. In Steiner's Atlantis, subraces were or are new generations of beings, where each generation represents a further sub-race away from the original Atlanteans, who were themselves a mist-like formalization of the ethereal spirit which preceded them. Would it be better if he had used the term recalcification or simply new life? It would have been, but those sensitivities weren't part of the world of the book's conception for everyone, though many people certainly did organize around anti-racism at the time. Language reflects the age, and the language of sub-races certainly echoes the views popular among European whites at that time. Which is why, although there are spiritually valuable ideas in the story of Atlantis, it will always remain somewhat suspect to me. Steiner is also a big fan of using biblical language to dramatize different epochs of history as developments within human consciousness, such as corruption, aberration, and betrayal. As such, it is easy to see how Malarian fundamentalists can get overexcited. One of the great strengths of religion is that it puts off the future indefinitely. Christianity is, after all, the enclosure of the eternal. For Christianity, everything that one does in this life is reflected in the next. It therefore follows that religions which make promises that can only be ratified in the future cannot be trusted. One advantage, at least, of thinking with the esoterics, such as Steiner, is their emphasis on the present and on an immediate connection with God, the universe, and deep time. Any wider political application of these ideas seems inevitably to lead towards doom and destruction. There are, I believe, simply some things that we are not designed to understand. Skepticism toward the esoteric approach of Steiner feels particularly deserved when one reflects that there are people who dedicate their entire lives to the discovery of whether some priest was the trillionth descendant of the master race of a sunken island, when, for Christ's sake, there are still objective, physical, you could go there and touch it, real island nations off the coast of Africa that do not feature on official maps. So much for surveillance capitalism. Or take, for example, Steiner's discussion of sun worship, a major facet for far-right groups globally. Rudolf Steiner believed, and I think one can therefore deduce that these beliefs extend deep into the mystery schools, that, quote, the great leader of the Sun Oracle, the greatest initiate of Atlantis, directed his attention above all to that section of human beings who differed from the ordinary population, for it was from them that understanding of the new age was to be expected, unquote. After all, the god Apollo, with whom the Corinthian capital came into existence, is known not only for his archery and agricultural prowess, but as a sun god, worshipped at Delphi, where I find not only the very first evidence of the Corinthian capital, but also an oracle. Some years ago, I entered the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem as a tourist. From studying the photos I took then, it now occurs to me that while a number of mutational variations adorn the outside of this temple, these carvings are literally just entry-level esoteric symbolism. So, obviously there's the Corinthian there. For further inside, the regular cycle of the sun is clearly praised above all else, in the innermost architecture of the building. This is not to highlight Judeo-Christian belief as somehow closer to one particular sun god or another, for all religions have strong components of sun worship, as well as the worship of other astral bodies. It is to reflect, as humans have always done, on the sheer magnitude of the cosmos and the curious position of apparently intelligent life among so much seemingly uninhabited matter. The fetish of sun worship becomes eerily enticing too when confronted with scientific papers such as sunspot cycle minima and pandemics. A Case for Vigilance at the Present Time, which proposes a direct correlation between the tides of the sun and its ejection of mass towards the Earth and pandemics. To me, the crucial elements of this hugely controversial paper by Wikmarashi et al., which was uploaded to the online academic portal ResearchGate on June 14, 2017, concern both the frequencies of solar activity and the predicted ground zero of a new viral mutation that could become a global pandemic in China. So to explain solar wind quickly, we have the sun, it pushes matter out through coronal ejection, and eventually it makes its way to Earth. Solar cycle minima are periods when the sun's internal tide that produces solar flares and humongous eruptions of plasma are at a low. Solar flares are the bright flashes of activity which are sometimes observable on the sun's surface. These are caused by complex currents of charged particles that are accelerated by magnetic forces operating through the sun's burning mass. Flares are closely associated with the ejection of plasma, which send particles through the sun's corona into outer space, known as solar wind. Quote, "The solar wind is matter, blown from the sun out into the whole solar system at up to 2 million miles per hour. We notice its impact when Earth's magnetic field diverts it toward our poles from the northern and southern lights, or when it makes comet tails, or when it damages electrical equipment," unquote. In Our Time, BBC Radio 4, Solar Wind, January 2020. The porosity and boundaries of the Earth's atmosphere are brought into focus in relationship to solar flares and the solar wind these flares emit by the paper Sunspot Cycle Minima and Pandemics, which predicts in 2017 that during a solar minimum, new viruses, bacteria, and other microscopic biological entities can penetrate the interplanetary magnetic field barrier and reach the stratosphere. Descent of such particles to ground level by means of gravitational settling may take months or years depending on size. The final descent phase through the troposphere would be mostly controlled by meteorological events. It is also of interest to note that the first descent of viral-sized particles deposited in the stratosphere will occur at places where the stratosphere is thinnest, and by this argument, populated areas of China lying eastward of the Himalayan mountain range would present the best candidates, unquote. However, the point of my referencing this is not to argue that solar activity can be directly linked to each pandemic here on Earth, but rather to show how enticing these ideas can be. After all, the theory was hastily rejected. Only 2 months later, in an article published by Cambridge University Press, Sunspot Activity and Influenza Pandemics, the Statistical Assessment of the Purported Association, August 29, 2017. This does not exclude them from being important thinking tools. Thinking at scale and in terms of deep time, one can afford to do so. Thinking at scale and in terms of deep time, when one can afford to do so, is by all means a nourishing activity that has been denied many of those who come to form what appear to be extremist conspiracy theories from the outside. From within all mythologies, things look different. And this is why there are clearly aspects of Rudolf Steiner's Atlantis that I find hard to ignore. For one thing, it is a very frank account of what the mystery schools and secret societies, such as esoteric Christianity or the Rosicrucians, of whom Steiner was a member, believe. However, even if everything in the story were factually true, on whichever plane of cognitive or extracognitive primordial reality the storyteller is taken to occupy, the paradigm of race and bloodlines is unequal to the task of discussing the millennium in which we now live. And so, finally, I have to attribute the racial anxieties of the Atlantis mythology, whether light or extra, first of all to racism, but also to the rude existence of difference in the face of a would-be unified whole in God. When I do try to look at these stylistic and philosophical elements in the context of the time in which they were written, it is worth remembering that, as mentioned above, the author states explicitly that, quote, in the post-Atlantean epoch, one should no longer speak of races, but of civilizations, cultures, unquote. The same can be said for what little he includes concerning gender, which is alluded to in the passage where he discusses humans as faithful copies, that nonetheless simply had to evolve. In the story of Atlantis, the secret knowledge held by the forebears of that sacred island colony was leaked to elements of humanity who had not been properly prepared for the responsibility. The misapplication of the power harnessed from the secret knowledge represents a great corruption involving the forces of growth and reproduction, which does read like tortured homophobia until a few pages later when he confirms that, quote, physically, the post-Atlantean humankind developed from Atlantean ancestors whose bodily forms had already solidified in a way that did not allow them to succumb to soul forces that were contrary to nature, unquote. Frankly, it feels to me as though there were specific issues where Steiner simply could not make up his mind, which is hugely problematic for someone who clearly wants to bring important wisdom into the age in which he lives. The publication of his Atlantis, almost 100 years after his death, would also imply that he did indeed want these ideas to endure for a long time. But I wonder, can't we do better than that? Does everything have to be a replication of the past? And what would have contemporary thinkers revealed? And what have contemporary thinkers revealed about replication and variation that allows us to comprehend esoteric ideals in the context of socio-political realities? In other words, if it is patriarchal norms which have wrought so much destruction on the planet, where might I begin in dismantling their most treasured hypocrisies? I want to think with Judith Butler here and the ideas she demonstrated about the normative nature of heterosexual culture over the course of human history. In her hugely influential work, Gender Trouble, 1997, Judith Butler reveals a great deal about the socio-cultural activity of replication. Troubling, one could also say investigating, gender formations, troubling the ascription of gender to sex, and troubling the modalities of replication available under the law of heterosexual society, certainly resonates with other forms of replication, mutant and epigenetic, discussed above. I agree with Butler when she asserts on page 31 that where gender non-binary lesbian and gay practices have sought to parody orthodox gender roles through the expression of contradictory or exaggerated gender formations, important work has been done to question the categories of male and female themselves. The effect of non-participation in the codes of heterosexual culture, as Butler argues, has been to disrupt the idea of a foundational set of laws concerning maleness and the feminine in all sorts of productive and exciting ways. These are prescient ideas for the identity politics of current and recent history, and again, set the stage for a radical and necessarily open-ended approach to the event of heterosexual society. Quote, the subject, the self, the individual, are just so many false concepts, since they transform into substances, fictitious unities, having at the start only a linguistic reality. That's Butler quoting Michelle Hart. That the natural biological world does not supply me with concrete models that can be used to forge social and political policy is, in any case, the reading I will pursue, given the eugenic, genocidal logic and toxic fallout that the application of biology to social theory has so recently engendered in the 20th century. Rather, I have sought to discuss biology as a model for thought, for speculative inquiry, as opposed to a model for behavior itself. What the biological behavior of mutation and epigenetic variation contribute to the philosophical questions of how to be in this world is perhaps sadly that there is in fact a choice concerning gender identity at all. Butler emphasizes the deed over the doer, an attitude which stands a great deal more chance of motivating the reader to act upon their assertions, challenge the ascription of gender, to penetrate and be penetrated by the world beyond them. For on acknowledging the replicating nature of hegemonic power to create sameness, the homogeneous pattern of heterosexuality begins to feel like an exaggerated form of legal theatre. Drawing on the work of Michel Foucault in his concluding book to the History of Sexuality in 1984, Gender Trouble posits the mechanisms of a legal culture that serves to establish the existence of a logical continuity in a narrative of causal relations. From the taboo around incest and physiological predestination by sex, creating the illusion of sexuality before the law, which is itself a creation of that law. That's Foucault. Therefore, in my mind, replication must always be understood as highly contingent, both contingent upon the socialization and contingent upon the internal ramifications of that socialization. A gathering of sociocultural norms and expectations which serve to reproduce sufficient labor to keep the fields ploughed, care homes staffed, and soldiers at war. A philosophical parallel with modes of biological development could be that breaking out of the politically constructed categories of sex has the ultimate goal of a full, though not necessarily final, mutation. Here, short-term epigenetic variation can also be meaningfully pursued as a way to think about a means of establishing a roadmap to a more radical self-realization, exploring what turns you off and on with little chemical tags if needs be. Coming out doesn't happen overnight, and it can be the product of years, maybe decades of short-term experimentation. In my own experience of this process, I have often reflected that the most problematic prohibition I ever faced was myself. But to be honest, it's difficult now to objectively assess the truth of this one way or the other. I made my decisions and dismissed opportunities for years. The fact that I didn't take the opportunities available, primarily from fear rather than legal constraints, reveals a lot about the capacity of the self, to construct its own limits. I wasted time. In a sense, I made my own time superfluous. But the most painful prohibition enacted upon the exploration of my sexuality was being called out by a friend, not for having gay pornography in my search history, but for the lie of heteronormativity that I was at that time still performing. In my experience, social and legal topographies combine to closet and recloset a lesbian, gay, pan or bisexual, transsexual or other non-binary person at its apex when that person is most alienated from themselves. At that particular juncture, living for a while in New York City in 2005, the only options I perceived to be available to me were the static replication of heterosexual norms or the whole-scale, out of the closet and never look back, total personal reinvention. Needless to say, as I identified as a skateboarding, graffiti-writing, hip-hop dude at that time, a consolidation of the two positions felt like a logical fallacy. Whereas today it strikes me that the condition was really a severe case of cognitive dissonance, brought on by and working in tandem with a form of lethargic depression. Aside from the fact that I wasn't living perhaps quite far enough away from home, I don't think I had really considered what bisexuality would even mean. And frankly, I felt shamed for that. With hindsight, there are certainly moments that stand out in my progression towards the space or expression of gender I feel myself to occupy now. Most of these moments were conflicts. Some were sexual encounters, and a lot of those were false dawns. I was finally lucky enough to live and work in a new environment of trust for a long enough amount of time to adapt apprehension into curiosity and desire into deed, rewiring the neural pathways that had split at some undefined young age into a duality of conflicting personas. At the end of the day, I simply had no reason to continue the facade of heterosexual replication any further. In any case, I'm with Butler when she states in the closing pages of Gender Trouble that, quote, the task is not whether to repeat, but how to repeat, or indeed to repeat and, through a radical proliferation of gender, to displace the very gender norms that enable repetition itself, unquote. Replication with variation, the very definition of biological life. In a way, I can see how the political right became tempted by the idea of biological determinism, because in a way, I can see how the political right became tempted by the idea of biological determination, because it is always comforting to think in simple terms. However, it also strikes me that although biological modelling creates the potential for strong allegorical argumentation, all analogies have their limits. Even analogies have to evolve. For example, once a new adaptation has been adopted within an organism, a ratchet mechanism prevents that species from slipping back down the evolutionary ladder. Unfortunately, no such mechanism exists for gay and non-binary persons who have begun to diverge from the program of cultural heterosexuality. For as Eve Koszowski-Sedgwick wrote in the 90s, the gay closet is not a feature only of the lives of gay people, but for many gay people it is still the fundamental feature of social life, and there can be few gay people, however courageous and forthright by habit, however fortunate in the support of their immediate communities, in whose lives the closet is not still a shaping presence. A year or two after coming out, I developed a conceptual apparatus that would go on to ensure that I would not slip back into that closet. As someone who had spent 20 years shape-shifting between nations, cities, semi-comprehended languages, and wonderful friends, at that time I felt as though recloseting was a real danger. That apparatus was the concept of deviant knowledge, elaborated upon in Here Comes Trouble. As readers of my first book have reflected, the concept of deviant knowledge is grounded in material processes of divergence, triggered by flows of energy and material. However, if the concept can be used to establish not a binary relationship between norm and deviant other, but a model that acknowledges the contingency of the category of other on the category of normality, I believe the concept can be meaningfully extended and modified. Deviancy seems to offer the promise of change, but change into what? In the year 2021, it is of course clearer to see that the changes which have been needed for so long, to some degree, have begun to take shape within the sphere of activism and culture. In the year 2020, groups across the world echoed the demands of Black Lives Matter and toppled the statues installed by their oppressors to evoke fear. The beginning of meaningful change occurred in the courts too, when Harvey Weinstein was sentenced in 2020 to 23 years in prison for an extensive history of sexual abuse, rape and manipulation brought about by the Me Too movement. And with the sentencing of Derek Chauvin to 22.5 years for the murder of George Floyd in June 2021. However, were these actions that I assert can be meaningfully described as forms of legal cultural mutation to become characteristics of the overall system, in order for the law to epigenetically fix these small gains for social good, a great deal more ground needs to be covered. Although organizing in the streets, COVID be damned, is still arguably the central mechanism for direct democracy around the world, our entire relationship with the very notion of publicness has logically undergone a sea change since the proliferation of advanced communication technologies. The web has brought the hysteria of interconnectedness and tracking into our lives, whether we are connected to it, for better or for worse. One catch that continues to hamper groups mobilizing against white supremacy and for social justice is being dismissed or patronizingly cherished as marginal. Such groups are often obliged to rely on highly articulated forms of identity politics until such time as it is no longer necessary to call out the barriers to Black and people of colour, LGBTQI+, disabled and persons and other minority groups. In order to walk the tightrope of claim formulation from a minority position without becoming delimited and categorically determined by those terms, the trick must be to create spaces and institutions that accommodate as many different voices and perspectives as possible, while simultaneously formulating clear demands. Though anti-social media have amplified the messages carried by Me Too, Black Lives Matter, and the Biden-Harris electoral campaign in the United States, every collected dot of data also serves to reinforce feedback loops of content. It is also sobering to recall just how close the Biden-Harris campaign was. This threatens to continue to grind us into a situation of extreme stagnation, the inherent logic of which is in imitation and repetition. These characteristics do not serve the demands for lasting change, particularly if real agency lies with Butler in subverting the instruments of replication themselves. I believe the category of oppressed is the historical product of the violent material and political suppression of the economic majority, what has become known as the 99%. As I seem always to be relearning, another form of that violence is erasure, which necessitates the retelling of minority histories from an apparently peripheral position in the first place. It is always remiss, therefore, when historically privileged persons attempt to highlight the contradictions of identitarian politics, as I have begun to outline above, despite my white middle-class European position. In my view, as someone who has thought about these issues for many years, the limits of identitarian politics should only be revealed in their relationship to the categorizing modes of power by the constituents of those minority groups themselves, which is to say, through self-determination, as opposed to the privileged judgment by those from without those groups who, more likely than not, have contributed to the socio-economic and historical circumstances of that oppression. Again, there is no silver bullet, no epigenetic reprogramming that can make the contradictions of power and democracy go away. But we do need a new picture of the world. We do need a full mutation of the systems of governance across the globe to counter monopolized media, corporate governance, and runaway global warming. And a picture of the world we stumble into, not substantiated by the unqualified, paranoid assimilation of hearsay, conspiracy theory, and cynicism that the internet has been all but consumed by. I therefore want to see robust institutions of multiplicity, capable of absorbing the shocks of global transformation without recourse to an over-individualized cultural landscape that somehow manages to make citizens both unaccountable through the decay of solidarity and culpable through the removal of state safeguards such as medical and social care. When I gather my thoughts to write this book, these arguments also beg the question as to the utility of the concept of deviant knowledge in the modern world. When appropriately discussed, dynamic spontaneity or deviancy should not really be used to invoke a romanticized periphery towards which humans could naively aspire. On the contrary, spontaneous radical insecurity will be the typical characteristic of the 21st century, as we are beginning to experience with the onset of the SARS-CoV-19 global pandemic. My goal must therefore be to retire the idea of deviancy in its relationship to a revolutionary vanguard or catalyst. It should be developed into something less predetermined by the status of otherness. Rather than act as a catalyst which remains itself largely unchanged, I want a concept of an entity, social, organic, biochemical even, that rolls with the punches, a way of being in this world that is necessarily compromised as it is committed. From deviancy to assembly, from cultural mutation to cultural epigenetics. Developing the arena of cultural epigenetics is simply my attempt to become accountable for the history of oppression and secrecy that has happened in my name. Thank you.